Hey everybody, HBCU Conversations back at you. I hope everyone is doing well. I had a bad hair day, so it's a great day to tell you you can get this HBCU Game Day cap at teespring.com. Also a great day to tell you if you go to hbcugameday.com, we have a 10% off discount code for Cross Colors. Man, you like that Tupac line? I know you like it. I know you're tired of me wearing it. I love Tupac so much, it's like every other interview. But we have that 10% discount code at hbcugameday.com. Joining us now from Houston, speaking of rap, he might rap a lot. I don't know. That's kind of comes with the territory in Houston, Texas. He's Dr. Kenyatta Cavil from inside the HBCU Sports Lab. One of my main men down in the SWAC. Sir, thank you so much for joining us. How are things in Houston for you this week?
Oh, it's going great. First, not that I can really hold a couple of bars, but I'm a huge fan of the rap scene, hip hop scene, especially here in Texas, whether it's our old school with the Ghetto Boys rap a lot, as you said, UGK with the slabs, or the new school with the screw. I do it all. I like to listen to it.
Man, you guys got the Ghetto Boys down there running for public office, man. It's crazy.
Oh yeah, no doubt. It was a good scene, and they were serious about it too. Brad Jordan actually almost got in there for that upset in terms of the runoff, so it was intriguing to see what was going on there. He's fighting the COVID-19, so that's something to watch there. It's pretty devastating to see someone that you grew up in a lot of ways saw as, if not a hero, somebody that you certainly were a fan of. So just a little bit, just letting you know how serious it is. So we certainly have, and myself and my family have washed our hands, stayed at home, did the social distance, as they said, or what I like to call social separation more than the distancing, because we're still finding a way to talk with each other, just like you're doing on this show here, to keep the information going on. Third and final part I'd talk about, and I'll make kind of two-part of it, is I added, as you said, professor here at Texas Southern University in sport management, sports studies with the undergraduate and graduate degrees, bachelor's science in sport management and a master's in sports studies and sports leadership. I've added, catch this, kindergarten instructor to my CV.
I see.
So that's coming to an end. You might be able to relate to that a little bit. This coming to an end this week, so I'm happy about that graduation, kindergarten. Yes, hey. We did it.
You the man. I know what that means.
Thank you.
I know what that. Look, I had a third grader and a kindergartner at the same time, man. I was trying to teach Spanish and fractions and this newfangled math. Whew, I'm glad it's over, man. It is. My summer break starts today, and I'm glad to kick it off with you, man, so we can talk some SWAC football here. Doc, a lot of conferences have started to make small adjustments, announcements for the 2020-2021 season. The Big South came out with something today where Hampton is and North Carolina A&T will soon be. They're kind of trimming back championships a little bit. Like, hey, if you're not in the top four, sorry about your luck. Their basketball tournament, they're kind of holding off a move to a different venue, and other conferences are making announcements as well. The SWAC is in a little better situation because they had a little bit of a nest egg to fall back on. When the NCAA cut their funding because of the lack of the tournament this year, Dr. McClellan joined us a couple of weeks ago and told us about how their frugal spending and decision-making is paying off now. But it still may impact the SWAC. We don't know. But just give us some insight of how big a football Saturday in the SWAC is and what that would mean, the impact, if it were to be affected in any way.
No doubt about it. When you talk about Saturdays football in the SWAC, in the deep south, southwest part of Texas, as you're talking about, it's big. There's a couple of ways that you can measure that. One of them I'd point out is the fact that the SWAC has led attendance essentially all but 1 year since they started measuring attendance at the 1AA and now FCS level. And that year, oddly enough, people may have remembered this storm called Katrina that had an impact on SWAC attendance and a little bit of everybody, but that was essentially the 1 year that's kind of the odd component of those years. So that's one measure. Another measure you talk about is HBCU classics. And usually when you talk about the largest classics in the country, 4 out of the top 5, you're talking about 8 maybe out of the top 10, 7 out of the top 10. Around those top numbers are SWAC member institutions. Participate in those games. If they're not conference games, there's certainly one conference game in there. So you have Magic City Classic that I saw you do a great deal of interview on that. You have the State Fair Classic. I think y'all even traveled to that game last year. Obviously, the Southern Heritage Classic, which features Jackson State, a SWAC member, and then a non-SWAC member in terms of Tennessee State. So can't leave out the Bayou Classic. So you're talking about major classics that show up in those top 5 games, and the only one outside of it essentially is the Florida Classic. And so that gives you some indication of just how big Saturdays are in the SWAC. Tailgating has come upon in the last 10 years, and so the homecomings are listed almost across the board as top 5, certainly top 10 when you talk about 8 of the 10 conferences. So those homecomings are the largest homecomings in the country in terms of how we measure HBCU. So they give you some indication of 3 or 4 different measures you can use to show you how big Saturday's football is in the SWAC, and then it becomes an economic issue as we move forward.
Doc, you are heavy into the business side of sports. I cannot imagine the headache it must be for people who are in administration, people who have rights to these bowl games and these classics, and how you're trying to plan, and you're cruising a ship into the unknown. You have a map, but you don't know if the map is still valid, because we don't know what's going to happen.
Exactly. And the major concern that you have is just so many different pieces that you got to get involved. So there's so many different levels, and people are looking at this slightly different at each level. So for example, obviously you have the federal level in terms of CDC and mandates. And then you have the association level for athletics in itself, which you're talking about the NCAA. So what are their guidelines for getting this done? And then you start to trickle down, and we haven't even got to the institutions yet, right? So now you got your state level mandates, your higher education, which is the governing part. And then you have those states with some type of higher education boards. And then you start to trim down a little more. I'll say, okay, now we start to get into institutions, but all of those have boards, whether they're individual boards, such as Southern, Texas Southern, or Alabama State. And then you have different types of boards where you have schools within systems, like you see in Mississippi at Prairie View. And then you have some states that have state governing boards, like in Alabama A&M, and those kind of components when you talk. So all these different types of ways that institutions have to answer. And then all of a sudden you finally get to campus, where you start looking at the president or chancellors. How are they looking at this? And obviously they first look at it from their mandates and states and federal levels, what they got to see. Then there may be a political component in there they got to measure. Then obviously they're looking at, in terms of their board, what is their board suggesting they do? And they're obviously looking at enrollment. What is enrollment going to look like in fall? And that is a direct correlation of how it hits your athletic departments, because most of our institutions are anywhere between 70 and 90% dependent on the enrollment influx of how they support their athletic department. So that is one thing that you don't hear much out there, because people talk about game guarantees, but game guarantees, we may get into a little deeper in terms of what they are, but oftentimes they may not be 1/10 of the budget. Now that could be significant if you got a $10 million budget, you got 1 million, but your other question you should ask yourself is, where's the other 9 million coming from? Well, a portion of that is coming from the institution due to enrollment and student fees. So let's say students come back to enroll in school, but they're doing online. Can you charge them the athletic fee if they're not on campus? And so you peel back those levels and you start asking yourself those questions. And then obviously you have this correlation between the conference. How is the commissioner talking about with these presidents and his body and her bodies in terms of what they're looking at? And then actually the athletic directors in terms of their alignments of what they're trying to see. So there's a lot of people, as you can tell, that are involved in terms of making this decision. And then you tag that along, if you're an outside person of all that and running a classic, you got to wait until all these people give you information before you can really start making your decision. So you're making contingencies, but they're going to just shift and move almost weekly or if not daily.
Yeah, because it all trickles down. The classics are looking to set their budgets and make their media buys dependent upon, normally the season is going to take place. You don't have to worry about that. So every decision is dependent upon another decision in front of them, and it just goes on down the line. So transparency and getting out in front of this and making those decisions as soon as possible will be key. But again, you can't rush it because there's so many factors that can change down the line. So it's a tough situation, man.
No doubt about it. You said it perfectly in terms of understanding that decisions on top of decisions, and then you have some decisions where you really would need to go back and they'll change a parameter of a decision you had. So let's say, for example, you do have a classic by a promoter, and they're waiting to put it on. So you have the State Fair Classic, to give you an example. It's partnered with the fair. So now you got to deal with not just your state level and the two campus presidents, if you would, their boards. Well, now you got the state fair going on. What's the state fair going to say in regards to the city of Dallas? Should they have a state fair this year? If they do, how are they going to manage it? Now, you can still have the game, but how does having the game without the fair manage in terms of what you're going to do in that game when they're so tied together? So that's another example where it can take even a different type of level where you have a third party component of it looking at how do they manage it. So it can get really significant in terms of the minutia, in terms of decision making. So it gets extremely intriguing. And then as a professor of sport management, and like you said, looking at how we dialogue about this, I'm always in the numbers trying to keep up with information so I can provide that either to students that are trying to study this or talk about it in a format like this.
Well, it provides great material for you when you do get back to your students because, the casual person just looks at it as, hey, roll out the ball, bring the band, let them play. This kind of peels back all of the layers that are involved in how the business of sports operates and how when those variables start to change, you got to have the right people in place that can adapt and make those new decisions moving forward.
Exactly. And that's what we're really excited about in our program, the business of sports, as we like to call it, the BS in sport management at the undergraduate level. We bring our students in and they literally look at business components of making decision making. So when we look at sport marketing and we, particularly in my classes, I always like to look at HBCUs as the case study, because you're talking about programs that often have limited resources in what they're doing. So if you can find a way to be creative and market these programs, which some people would say in marketing is maybe a niche program, it is always much easier to now go out and work at a professional level in terms of professional teams because they have significant more budget in terms of making those ideas that you have come to fruition. So I have our case study analysis on HBCUs, and that's really something I think is special about our program at Texas Southern University.
Okay, Doc, I've seen where, or I won't say I've seen it. I'm pretty sure that I can say Alabama, Clemson, LSU, Ohio State. If those teams had to play with no fans or limited fans, they have the resources where they probably could make that sort of sacrifice. I don't think anyone at the HBCU level could sustain a no fan, no gate environment. Am I off task, off base with that?
No, I think you're really providing an insight that people may not consider. When you're talking about the Power 5 schools, particularly the ones, like you said, the upper echelons, it really is significant. And a lot of that is because of the television money. So people have heard about that, but what do we mean by the television money? So when we talk about the Big Ten has major deals, one with Fox Sports, if you would, and then a second component with ESPN. So they do this framework in terms of how they have two dual components of their TV contract. And let me back up a little bit as I was pausing and thinking in there, is you have multiple levels for your TV contract, just so people are clear on this. You have what you call your tier one your second tier, and then tertiary tier, which is the third tier. So when you have that, is you'll have first tier where you have these major deals. For example, for the SEC, they do a major deal with CBS. Now, ESPN just recently bought that out to kind of bring it up to speed. But for example, when they had that CBS deal, CBS would get the first right to pick a game on Saturday that they wanted to air. And then they went to their secondary rights. The secondary rights were bought by ESPN, right? And they decided to buy a cluster of games that they would put on their ESPN games of the week, and they could split it over to ABC for night games and things of that nature. Then you have your tertiary rights. Those tertiary rights for the longest where schools would have their own rights, and they might do regional networks. SEC, what they did is they had all the schools bring back their tertiary rights, give them back over to the conference, and the conference went in and then made a third-party deal with SEC to create their own network. Well, the Big Ten was the first one to kind of put it on the table, and they did that themselves. The reason I bring that all up, people have heard about the major deals when SEC or Big Ten schools, and the other ones are a little further behind, but they have significant money too, that they'll come in the season where they might get a check for $40 million, $35 million. That's before they even have football practice. Not a game, but football practice, as Allen Iverson would say.
We're talking about practice.
They got a check. Practice. They get a check that allows them to supplement it. So for them putting on a game without fans, while they won't get the gate, so it'll hurt them some. And then there's also the component where a lot of their ties for boosters that give money to the athletic program are tied to seating license. So there's some money that will hurt them there. But the overall television money really allows them to be in a much safer space in terms of generating money and putting those games on. So how does this go back to HBCUs? HBCUs for the classics, in a lot of ways, is my understanding that we go back to that State Fair Classic versus the Bayou Classic. When you talk about Grambling playing in both, they get sizable checks for those games. Southern Heritage Classic, we heard that you're talking about $320,000, depending on ticket sales, that could go up maybe almost to $400,000, $500,000 just on those type of games, classics. Even if you back down and you go to homecoming, you're talking about $50,000, $70,000, $80,000, $100,000 on those games, particularly if you have games on campus and basically your stadium's already paid for, so all you're paying is operation costs. Now, there's some schools out there that may have a secondary stadium where if their attendance is not high enough that paying for operations could actually hurt them. But generally speaking, what you said is absolutely right. It's going to be a major challenge for our HBCUs to play a game without fans and still be able to generate money because they don't have the television money to offset that cost.
All right, let's just play the hypothetical game. Let's say each conference puts together a robust streaming package, pay-per-view. Is there enough bandwidth for people to pay to see the game virtually that could make a difference, kind of fill the void?
It certainly can make a difference, but that's something that you see schools kind of testing out over the years where they stream some games and they would stream them for free. You had some cases, basketball championships I've seen, like, for example, at Prairie View, Alabama State for a while, I think did it, where they did actually pay for streaming. They got their season ticket holders paying that, but a lot of that you have to recustom your fans to understand about paying for streaming. Now, you've seen ESPN do this on a much larger level, and they're able to leverage all their different packages and put it together so people are more likely to pay for it. So there is a lot of energy that needs to go up front to teach and make sure your fans are comfortable with that and the benefits for them doing that, which is a huge marketing package, which means you need to invest in that marketing component on it. So I think it would be a challenge to do it without really setting up, educating your fans on what this means, why it's important, and things of that nature. So yes, you can do it, but I think just to do it without marketing it, branding it in such a way, I think it would be a bigger challenge and probably put yourself in a deficit, because this is, to me, a 2 or 3 year plan that needs to be done at some point, because that's where the industry standards are going. But to do it right away now, I think it would be a major challenge to get over that hurdle.
Yeah, and having streamed events before, my philosophy has always been, make it free, get your advertisers in to support it because when the fans have to pay, if one camera angle gets wrong, if one little thing goes wrong, everybody wants their money back.
Exactly.
It's a
So
tough crowd.
it's a tough crowd and it's a tough challenge. You have to know your market. As we talk about our students in marketing, again, sports marketing, you really have to know your fan base. And so that's where it can get fun, and that's where the science part of this comes in, right? We say a bachelor's of science in sport management. That's where the science of the art of business instruction takes place. You really need to know the components of your market as we break it down. There's one little frame where we talk about our students where we say, you need to get your fans on this escalator. Well, the escalator goes up. You want your fans as high as they can on this escalator because that means they're more dedicated to your program. So, for example, one of the most dedicated athletic sponsorships out there was NASCAR. They said they had the highest turn of dollars when you put NASCAR on a product, people would buy it. One of the other ones, obviously, as you would think about it, be the NFL. So that's something that the SWAC has to work for. We have a unique fan base that is certainly passionate and dedicated, as you talked about in the first end of your question. But how do you tribute that, and have you really taught them the importance of supporting the SWAC outside of just attending games, meaning buying product associated with the SWAC? And so that's where you start having your questions with the streaming that you've probably seen in various ways of why there could be some long-lasting struggles with doing that. So creating that brand and that marketing is extremely important.
Here's something that really intrigues me. So Doc, you've been SWAC all your life, right?
Correct.
Okay, I grew up CIAA. I went to Winston-Salem State. Know a little bit about the MEAC, but I lived in North Carolina for 40 years. Moved to Atlanta, and I really didn't know much about the SWAC outside of the very obvious things with Grambling, Southern, the things that you just can see from afar no matter where you are. So, I had to cut my teeth on the SWAC with Alabama State and Alabama A&M and everybody coming through there, and then I came up to speed. Is the key to HBCU sports, do you think it will always be a regional product where fan bases are dedicated to their conference and their geographic footprint, or is there room for it to mesh, have synergy, and for HBCU sports to be all encompassing, or will it always be a regional type thing, business-wise?
I think for the most part, historically, you're going to see it as a regional component. And again, that's more of the social historical components of these four, what I refer to as 5 major conferences, with obviously CIAA being the oldest, 1912, and then SIAC 1913. You had a Midwestern Conference that actually moved into parts of the SWAC as it grew and expanded from 1920, the third conference, bringing in Grambling and Jackson State, Texas Southern over the years. There is a component that is a national component of it that you could drive because you have these enclaves of large population of African Americans in major cities where you start to see these classics out of Chicago, Detroit, LA for a time, obviously New York with the different classes up that way and across the country. So you do have some national appeal in that framework, particularly in the sport of football, maybe not so much in the other sports, which are certainly more regional. So what you want to do is find a way to find out what is national about your conferences or brands or HBCU sports in general, which I just identified with the classic and football, and which are more regional. And then that's how you start putting packages together that deliver that content in that manner. So I think it's a combination of two, leaning more towards regionality, but there are some components that you can get a national brand too. Just like in the CIAA for basketball, while it's certainly a regional component of it, there's some national frameworks of the CIAA basketball tournament. So they need to find a way to expand that in a way. And if you're like the SIAC and the MEAC or Gold Coast Athletic Conference, you need to start looking at those two conferences and what they were able to do nationally and find out how you can start to do it yourself within your conference and brand.
Yeah, sometimes I just try to look at Atlanta, and I like what the MEAC and SWAC Challenge and the Celebration Bowl is doing. But I'm like, what is Atlanta? Because everybody's here. I think this city is the largest as far as HBCU, grad chapters and alumni. But I'm like, man, we could have something like even more than just the beginning and the end of the football season that kind of has cross sectional HBCU ties and try to use that as a strength to build out the product as a whole.
I love that you brought in Atlanta. Atlanta is in so many different ways the Mecca. There's things that Atlanta has done to rebrand itself, particularly as a college city. We already knew it as a major melting pot in terms of a black city, a chocolate city, as many people would call it, in terms of what we hear in terms of hot Atlanta. And where you have all these different African Americans coming to the city with different economic bases, and many of them educated, certainly as you see with the HBCU schools. Many of our schools have Atlanta as at least their top 3, certainly top 5 largest alumni bases. And some of them obviously are up there as number 1 and 2. And that's both from the MEAC, SWAC, CIAA, certainly the SIAC, to name a few. So I think the biggest part of Atlanta is a strategy. We see it from a national perspective. ESPN, Walt Disney is certainly understanding it with the Celebration Bowl, MEAC, SWAC, putting it there. You used to see it back in the day with the 100 Black Men with the Classic, the Atlanta Classic you had. But I think if you're talking about being a visionary, understanding the next move, whichever of the schools, if you would, and I'm particularly talking about what I call the major division, which is HBCUs at the FCS level, MEAC or SWAC, whichever one of those conferences can get into Atlanta first with the institution in the Atlanta market will really can change the dynamic. Let's think about it just from a SWAC, this perspective. If you could book in this conference with Houston, a major market on one side, and Atlanta on the other side, and then you have cities in between that are merging cities such as New Orleans, Birmingham, Jackson. You book in that, and that's not even including the fact that you got Dallas for the State Fair Classic. You have this 2 regions locked up with major metropolitan cities where you can do like a basketball tournament, if you would, in Houston with a football championship game in Atlanta, or vice versa, since you already have the MEAC Challenge there and the Celebration Bowl, but you have a basketball tournament later in the spring to celebrate things, but you have a championship game in Houston. There's ways to leverage that, as you talked about earlier, on a national level where you start to really see the changing of the framework. So that's where I'm talking about innovation, if you would. How do you innovate HBCU sports? How do you innovate the Southwestern Athletic Conference? And Dr. Charles McCullin, the commissioner over there in the SWAC, is somebody that I've had the chance to talk with, and I certainly know what he understands about innovation, and he's looking to do that for the SWAC. So he's basically got the SWAC on solid ground, as you alluded to earlier, in terms of them being in a much better position than they were just 2 or 3 years ago before he's taken over. Oh, so don't be surprised if he continues to push the buttons further, and that other institutes start looking at the SWAC as the place to be, and they start looking at maybe finding the ways to seek, is there a way to join the conference? Do you see conference expansion taken from that perspective? Because they want to be a part of this brand that continues to grow, because it has the historical footprint, but now it's looking at strategy and innovation and tactical analytics about how it grows its brand. So those are some things moving forward, even out of this pandemic, if you would, COVID-19, of what is to come.
Hey, if you're just, out there hitting the fast forward button and then you're just skimming through, we're talking with Dr. Kenyatta Cavil. He is from Houston, Texas. He has a radio show inside the HBCU Sports Lab with Dr. Cavil. And Charles Bishop is right there with you, one of my friends as well. What is it about the SWAC that we don't hear anything about people wanting to leave? The MEAC has had two departures, and people are talking about the geographic distance from FAMU to Delaware State, and of course people are speculating could other teams be looking to leave. I hear a lot of scuttlebutt. I don't think I may have heard something, but I didn't put a lot of credence into it. But there's been nothing really credible about people wanting to get out of the SWAC. What is it about that conference?
Well, it has been probably the most consistent conference in terms of its membership, particularly since 1998, when you had 97 and 98, when you had Arkansas Pine Bluff come back to the SWAC and Alabama A&M joined the SWAC, which really created an interesting rival on another level, because the Alabama State, Alabama A&M athletic games now became conference games, if you would, and means that they even could be worth much more in terms of who won those, especially for those bragging rights. But outside of that, quietly, there were some SWAC schools that started looking the other way. They did a better job of keeping it quiet for the most part. Like you said, you may have heard some whispers here and there, and that was under the leadership of the previous commissioner. But with them selecting Charles had the benefit of being the athletic director at Texas Southern University, and before that, Prairie View A&M University, where his relationships with athletic directors had them with a level of trust. And so they were willing to listen to where he wanted to go. And then once he got the buy-in from the presidents and chancellors, and he was able to turn it around in a little over a year financially, then things quickly changed. And it's intriguing of just how quickly they can. So now you're starting to hear the whisper on the other side that teams are starting to look over there at the SWAC and say, hey, what are y'all doing? Y'all are growing. Y'all brand name is high. We may want a piece of that. So I think the historical partnership, when you talk about going back to 1920, and then certainly from around 1950 to 1960s, you have the same main public institutions in the SWAC that have stayed together. And then again, after that last expansion, it's really been solid. So that's a lot of it. So you've had some interest, some people coming in terms of even non-historically Black college universities, but they traditionally haven't had football. And so the SWAC hasn't really seriously looked at expansion from that perspective. And then you just had the changing of guards with the presidents and things of that nature, and that's kind of slowed down to some degree. So I think the saliency and just how firm the SWAC is has really held sturdy, and I have to give a lot of credit to the current commissioner, Dr. Charles McCullen, in terms of what he quickly was able to do with moving the conference forward.
You read my mind. I was going to ask you, do you ever see an opportunity where a non-HBCU would join the SWAC, or at least, have enough to report that there was some interest and some traction there?
Yeah, I know just from doing my research at one time, Centenary, as they were looking at trying to figure out a home, they had a serious look at the SWAC. Again, their problem was they didn't have football. You had a school out of Texas, Grand Valley. At one point, they had a serious look at the SWAC. Again, their problem was they didn't have football. So the presidents would certainly look at it and be open to it. They would have to make sure academically the schools fit the academic component of the SWAC. But as I just said, and we talked about this whole show, football is huge in this conference. So it's going to be a challenge for a conference member to join or seek to join this conference if they don't have football as their base. And that's where it's kind of stopped, where I've seen, as you talk about non-HBCUs, or what I refer to as historically white colleges and universities, HWCUs, to join the conference without that. And frankly, we still have a historical lens where racial components of this have to be played out. And that's not always on the historically Black college side, as we've always been welcoming for students. It was historically white college historically that didn't allow African Americans or non-European white individuals in the schools. So oftentimes they still see the component of joining what we would refer to as a white conference first before they would look at a HBCU conference such as the SWAC is almost secondary. And so if you're going to look at this conference secondary, then it becomes a challenge for people to take you seriously.
And it's not totally unprecedented that a conference can join on a per sport level. Very small here,
Correct.
but you got Howard is a member of the SWAC as far as women's soccer because they don't offer it in the MEAC. So that always gets people's heads turned. What do you mean Howard's in the SWAC? What's like? Calm down.
I love it.
It's just women's soccer. We're not wrong
That's
on
true.
that. You might catch us
Yeah.
wrong on something else, but that's something that people often have a double take with.
Yeah, I like that. It's funny when you bring that up. Yeah, Howard's in the SWAC. What? No, nah, you don't know what you're talking about. Yeah, you don't know what you're talking about. Have you ever checked out SWAC women's soccer?
Yeah.
And they won the conference several times over. I think 3 out of the last 4 out of 5 years. The first year, obviously, they couldn't earn the automatic bid, but they've really come in, barnstorming in the conference. But look, there may be some changes even coming with that. The SWAC has been a conference that really likes the regionality of the conference. They like teams to play in just about all sports. Certainly have to be football. I think they lighten the rules to some degree about participating in all sports, so that might open it up some. But at the end of the day, if you're going to come to the SWAC, you certainly have to have football, or in a lot of ways, it's just not very realistic. Yeah. So the next question starts to become, well, what about other schools looking in there? With you talking about Tennessee State, FAMU is always out there with the changes. I can tell you this: when you look at it, I would not look for the SWAC under Dr. Charles McCullough's leadership to go seek these conferences, particularly FAMU, because he has a great relationship with Dr. Dennis. So in a lot of ways, it's going to be these institutions that kind of first make the interest in terms of expansion. As right now, the SWAC really wants to grow what it's doing in terms of revenue dollars, its brand, being the first at the table to have these discussions on the national level with NCAA, making sure that their ADs, the commissioners on certain panels that have influence on what is going on at the FCS level and Division I level for all the sports. So that's something to keep in mind. Is one thing that's out there about Tennessee State that I want to make sure people understand on the record, because you always hear this rumor in regards to them not being able to join a Black conference. There's no legislative mandate that anybody can find out there. Obviously, a lot of people are talking about the historic component of when there was a merger between University of Tennessee at Nashville and Tennessee State based on a federal court case that came out in terms of needing to merge these institutions for segregational reasons. Well, that did take place, but that has nothing to do with the athletic side. And it really was Tennessee State joining the OVC for basketball purposes, because people don't realize at that time, the automatic bid for Division I conferences when the tournament was just 24 and then 32 teams was more significant. You just couldn't hear independent teams getting in the tournament other than maybe like Notre Dame with these big records. So it's important to get into a conference so you can get the automatic bid. And regionally, you have to remember Alabama A&M wasn't in the conference at that time. Alabama State just joined in 1982. So when they joined the OVC in 86, it's a whole different landscape than what would happen now if they would even consider looking at it. Totally different framework, and it wouldn't have to do anything with legislative mandates.
It would be the story of the decade if TSU were to leave the OVC. We talk about it every year, like come on home. But they give us a few HBCU matchups each year that everybody eats up. But then when they start playing, the Tennessee Techs of the world, we're like, okay, we'll holler.
Exactly, and that's where you would have to see somebody put a real good strategic, innovative plan together that really speaks to the dollars. I hadn't seen that done with these conferences in terms of expansion. Oftentimes, expansion is looked at more about trying to build the brand of the institution, and so those are the things you look at. And then when you talk about the MEAC, one of the toughest things that I think we point to North Carolina A&T being the big elephant in the room, because how much success they had, and obviously before that announcement was Hampton. But I think one of the most challenging issues for the MEAC really goes back to Winston-Salem State. Looked like they were going to move in the conference before the other three came in. That was really intriguing in terms of what took place there with that mandate, and even more so with Savannah State. Exactly. When they moved out, now you don't have that contiguous conference framework, and you have FAMU and Bethune-Cookman way down here at the bottom, which took away. Because if you had Winston-Salem State, those other schools, now you have 14 schools. You can put up 7 geographically. MEAC could have had a football championship game. So all kinds of things can take place. But once Winston-Salem State decided that it was not for them to make the move, and then certainly with Savannah State, now it becomes a challenge with the distance, particularly when you're talking about going back to COVID-19 and the pandemic. That's the real issue that you have now in terms of these conferences, is travel considerations. And now travel considerations is not just about dollars associated with taking plane rides, how much you're going to put students on a bus in terms of them in that nature. Now it's talking about the safety and health component until we get a vaccine. So these are some things where I know people are really studying and looking at. Nothing has really got to the point where they're talking to their boards yet, but that's the next level in regards to what could take place in these conferences as they move forward.
I'm not going to defend my Rams. There's a lot of thoughts on that, and that horse on this side of the river has been beaten quite a bit. But
I'd imagine
it did change a lot, and it's ironic that Dr. Harold Martin was the chancellor of Winston-Salem State. He leaves, his idea gets shifted and abandoned, and then he goes to A&T, and then A&T leaves the MEAC. So when you go back in history and you start to connect the dots of how things influenced the rise and the fall, and how these conferences, and not saying the MEAC is falling, but just the ebb and flow of everything, that some of the players are involved at multiple sites, which is quite interesting.
No doubt about it. We, in the academic frame, which we call it conference churning. So what you're talking about is a natural thing. Schools are always going to look for the next opportunity. So that's why it's so important for conferences to continue to stay in the forefront, as we said, with innovation, branding themselves, tactical frameworks, and strategy and strategic alignment of what takes place. So you're right. When people didn't really necessarily see Winston-Salem State as a linchpin, but as you just alluded to from both parts, it is significant when you talk about the bigger picture of what things come back later when we really tie the dot historically.
Doc, does this create, talking with Dr. Kenyatta Cavil, he's hanging out in Houston, Texas, his home, with us today here at HBCU Game Day. Does the COVID and everything kind of going virtual and people having to shift gears, and Dr. McClellan talked about this, how the SWAC, being a quote unquote low resource conference, is used to operating like this, to kind of get it from the mud philosophy. We talked about all the negatives and setbacks that are possible. Is there a way that it creates an opportunity for a step in evolution for the SWAC and the MEAC, CIAA, all these guys, that this new way of doing business isn't necessarily new to them, and they can use it to their advantage in any way moving forward?
Certainly. I've heard different coaches as well as commissioners say that they receive calls from what we refer to as the Power Five memberships, in terms of them asking questions of how they got things done, because they were used to being flush with cash, and they know these institutions and conferences were not. And so there's some things that they bring to the table. So certainly out of dire situations, tragic situations, often comes innovation and strategies in terms of how you do things differently. So I think all that stuff is in the ecosystem to take place. So that's where the SWAC and the other HBCU conference have an opportunity to continue to move forward in terms of doing things that they have done over a period of time. I think the real indication is you see that there will be some significant losses if games can't take place. We've kind of hit on them in some ways in regards to the NCAA tournament cutting off money. I think that could be worth about $500,000 to the various schools. But depending on how they did their budget, those are things that they could overcome. It starts to get a little more challenging if you don't have the classic in the fall, because now you're talking about budgets taking a hit from anywhere of $750,000 to $1 million in terms of football guarantees, classic money, and things of that nature, and gate receipts. Now, obviously, that's some of the larger brands such as FAMU, Jackson State, if you would, Southern, North Carolina T, and some of those big brands that are out there, and even to the next level when you start looking at Grambling, Alcorn, and Prairie View. Now you have some of the other schools that have struggled with attendance. In some ways, it might cost them, they might actually save money in terms of being in a deficit because of not having football. So we do have to make sure we put that out there. But the final part of that, when you talk about this big picture, is the fact of what is the next step of that revenue sequence that takes place, and how do you find a way to change that over? And that's going to be the enrollment of students in the fall that we go back to. That's going to be a significant factor that everybody should keep their eyes on. If you're a fan of HBCUs, you have to find a unique way to recruit for these institutions or partner with these institutions, because they really need the enrollment to maintain itself, whether it's physically on the campus, if not certainly in terms of their online delivery of these campuses, going into a different instruction mode, didactical instructor mode. So when you talk about that, that's something that I really want us to focus on, is the enrollment side of this. We'll get our first indicator this summer, as we just talked about, literally closing out the fall with these virtual graduations, these different types of graduation celebration, and Mother's Day as usually huge gatherings from graduation. So we've seen that, which means summer school is right around the corner in 2 or 3 weeks. That's going to give you the first indication of what enrollment is going to probably look like in the fall. Early indications is it seems like those summer enrollments are pretty much on pace. So that's a good thing in terms of what we've seen in the past. So the next indicator is in terms of fall registration. What do those fall registration of courses look like? Because enrollment in our HBCU institutions, just like all the rest of them across the country, but more so when you talk about the budgetary issues, even associated with athletic programs, what will the enrollment look like for these institutions in the fall? If they maintain a significant amount of those students or somehow even grow it, all the much better. Then a lot of the things that we're talking about, concerns, will become positives, as you just asked, in terms of moving forward with these institutions and the respective athletic program.
Yeah, I think you and I talked about this last week when we were just chatting on the phone. I think the kids who are dedicated to going to college and know they want to do something with their life, they're going to be in college somewhere. They're not going to sit on the sidelines. I think the key demographic is going to be, and we all know them, and sometimes the truth hurts, there are kids that go to school, HBCU or otherwise, that not going to be there for long. They're in the NFL. They're going to be there a semester or two. It's because their mama told them they got to go to college, but their heart is not in it. I think this maybe leaves the door open for mama to say, all right, if you don't want to go, you don't have to go. I think those fringe kids, which get replaced every year, but they still count as part of the money that goes to that school, they are still a butt in the seat. That may end up being one of the most important demographics when you start looking at enrollment and sustainability.
No doubt about it. That's a significant part of the market, and it's become even more so as institutions have had to start reporting not just their graduation rate, but also their progression rate and their retention rate. Progression meaning that they move from one semester to the other semester. We've heard about this a little bit when we talk about APR. That's one of the components in measuring APR. Do your students return, and do they return eligible? Well, that has kind of moved over to the academic side when we're measuring progression rate. Are students first coming, as we talk about enrollment, and then are they progressing from one semester to the next semester coming back? And are you retaining those students? Retention in terms of are they coming back the following year? So there's been a concerted effort for a lot of HBCUs to increase those retention and progression numbers. And so those are programs on campus to really work with students that are often termed first generation, is the generation of students that you're most likely to have those challenges with. that have not necessarily come from high schools that had the best learning environments for them. So there's a struggle there. We found HBCUs have the ability to nurture them in such a way. Well, how do you do that nurturing in this environment? So your point in terms of what is taking place is extremely important. And I know for a fact there are institutions that are dedicated and looking at that. So now that's where more of that innovation needs to take place. How are you going to be able to build an environment that has moved from on campus to virtual in such a way? But these presidents and chancellors, when I finally say this, they're looking at all these options. It's very important that we also get this in into the conversation, I should say, excuse me, is that you even have some people talking about having these different hybrids of type of institutions where you will have students that want to do online. You'll allow them to stay at home and they can do their own online classes. Those students that feel more comfortable being on campus, they'll do that. And they'll find a way that possibly maybe a Monday, Wednesday, and Friday class, that Monday half the students will meet. They may meet for a little longer time, and then the other half will meet on Wednesday, and then Friday it's online. So you have those kind of things. You have some institutions that are talking about if they reopen, that they may not reopen till October, and then they'll close in November. So they'll extend the days, if you would, so they can meet the average contact that is necessary for state and accreditation purposes, but they'll shorten the period of they'll actually be on campus. Some of that is to start later to make sure they've gotten as much information as possible, can do all the things, recruit longer to get students back in class, and then shorten it up so you won't get in the flu season where they're thinking about there's a possible second surge of this. So look at all these different options to be on the table. You see this both at HBCUs. I think Howard President was talking about that on the national framework. I've heard that right across the street at our private institution, Rice University, looking at these things. So again, you're going to see many of these chancellors and presidents looking at more innovative ways to bring educational aspects to students that are wanting to earn their degrees. And they're talking to each other. Mm-hmm. All these individuals are talking to each other and churning these bright ideas. So just keep your eyes open and looking in terms of what is taking place, because things, as we started at this conversation, are changing, and they're changing on a daily, weekly, certainly a monthly clip. So all these things that we're talking about now are just on the cutting edge, and you'll learn more about them as time moves forward.
I was just sitting here thinking, the Generation Z, I think that's, and forgive me, Generation Z, I get mixed up about who's in college right now because I'm so old. But kids, we'll just say kids. Kids today are a lot more introverted than maybe you and I were when we were coming up. Just because of the way society is, you can do so much on your phone. You can have a voice without having to go out and stand in front of a bunch of people. And the workplace may be moving to more of a virtual workplace. So part of the training and the kind of building that muscle memory of working independently, working from home, could be very good. My wife, for example, has had to start working from home. And it was an adjustment period for her because she's used to being out in front of people. And then she was at home, but still had to focus and get things done when she didn't have those visual and mental benchmarks in front of her like she's accustomed to out in the field. So there could be some benefit. As weird as it sounds for our generation, that could be beneficial in many ways.
No doubt. The students learn differently in terms of, and those professors out there really start that keep up with their craft, understand of their teaching style and how they teach to different generations of students, how they just teach to different students anyway, because some of them are more visual learners, some are more tactile learners, some are more audio learners. So those professors that really are true about their craft, they incorporate those different learning styles within their classroom. So you take that up to the next level of how do you now find different ways to provide instruction. Whether it is from asynchronous or synchronous online learning, to give you some frameworks about that. But we've seen this quantum leap take forward a couple of years ago, if you would, when you started hearing about these flex schedules, where you had every other Friday off. Some people just went 4 days a week. You had other companies that were putting more people at home for different reasons. You have a lot of this innovation in your tech companies. They have reformed the way work looks. And so now, because of necessity, you're going to see that taking place. And if it becomes more beneficial, creates employers that can even provide more innovation, businesses will take advantage of it. And in this case, it's necessary for the health of the Commonwealth and the nation in a lot of different ways in their framework. So no doubt about it, higher education, secondary education, in a lot of ways, you're going to see this continuous growth of how do you change the platform of your students. And higher education must make sure that they're in a place to take advantage of what's going on in the real world. So certainly your point is well taken, and I agree with it. That's what you're going to start seeing moving forward, and some positive things that start coming out of this. And I don't want to sound too much like a recorded record, but that's why I say it's important to look at not just strategy, not just tactics, but the innovation moving forward in terms of institutions, both from an athletic perspective and also from an academic perspective.
Well, Doc, you and I could just nerd out on this stuff probably for another 2 hours, but we'll save some for the next time. But do tell us where people can find you as you guys do your radio show every week inside the HBCU Sports Lab. Give us some info on that so people outside of the area who haven't checked you out yet can get involved there.
I appreciate that. Yes, come check us out every Tuesday from 6 to 7 Central Standard Time. You can catch us on Facebook Live. That's at Inside the HBCU Sports Lab. You can catch us if you're in the Houston area at 12:30 a.m. for the terrestrial component of the show. And obviously, you can follow me on the social media platforms of Instagram, Twitter, Facebook at Dr. Kenyatta Cavil. That's DrKenyatta Cavil, DrKenyatta Cavil. And while we're talking about innovation, we're meeting on that level too. So don't be surprised if Tolly, Carr, and I find a way to get some of this HBCU game day and inside the HBCU Sports Lab to partner on some projects, if not more. So keep your eyes open. We're working for the people. We're going to make it happen. And with that said, I'm going to be interested in that cap. I'm a cap person, so I plan to get me one, support it around there. I'll put it on the show so people know.
I got one coming for you.
Appreciate it. Cross colors. We'll see if we can get on that and support that as well. As we talked about at the beginning of the show, I'm a big hip hop fan, and anything with Tupac on it, I certainly can have in my closet.
They got a lot. Man, Steve has one that has. There's 3 Tupacs going across. It's like a yellow, a green one, and a red one, man. It's awesome. So
yeah, I have to go check it out.
Yeah. So if you're there watching, just go to our website, hbcugameday.com. We got a 10% off discount code, and you can pick out whatever you want. You don't have to wait on me to try to send you one because I sometimes overpromise.
No problem. I'm good at only get it myself. I don't like to wait. That just means I have 2 of them.
I'll take care of you, Doc. I was just talking to the fans out there.
Okay, no problem. I appreciate it.
All right, it's been a lot of fun. Dr. Kenyatta Cavil joining us today on HBCU Conversations. Thanks, Mom, for sticking to the end. You're probably the last one left. It's been a lot of fun. We'll talk to you guys later.
Take care.